talk about two different subjects, one being a census and one being a Sabbath. In Exodus chapter 30, God initiates Moses to take a census and count the men of Israel. We're going to read about that in just a moment. And I'm going to allow some time. We're going to talk about that for a little while. And then we'll move on to a Sabbath. And we'll talk about that for a few minutes. God initiates a census to number the people of Israel. And we're going to talk about two different censuses that takes place, one in Exodus chapter 30 and one in 2 Samuel that David initiates, both counting people. And a controversy takes place during these censuses. In one, David gets in trouble. And in one of these censuses, which is mentioned in Luke, it is what causes Joseph and Mary to go back to Bethlehem, which was the cause of Jesus being born there. But let's start with the first one. We're going to compare the two censuses that take place, one in Exodus 30 and one in 2 Samuel 24, because they both number the people of Israel, but for different reasons. That's what we're going to talk about. Father, we thank you this morning for the privilege of Sunday school. Father, invade this place this morning. Be with each and every one of us this morning and make this a worthwhile time as we open your word for you to talk to us, each of us personally this morning. Reach into us, Lord, and give us knowledge and turn that knowledge into wisdom. Let us leave here with more than we came with, which will equip us for the coming week. Touch each of us in a personal way, and Lord, if you choose to, make each of us teachers. Let us see different viewpoints and learn from those as the Holy Spirit initiates all of us to participate. Give us the eyes, the ears, and the mind of Christ, and everyone said, amen. Exodus chapter 30, starting with verse number 11. Then the Lord said to Moses, when you take a census of the Israelites to count them, each one must pay the Lord a ransom for his life at the time he is counted. Then no plague will come on them when you number them. Each one who crosses over to those already counted is to give half a shekel, according to the sanctuary shekel, which weighs 20 gerahs. This half shekel is an offering to the Lord. All who cross over, those 20 years old or more, are to give an offering to the Lord. The rich are not to give more than a half shekel, and the poor are not to give less when you make the offering to the Lord, to atone for your lives. Receive the atonement money from the Israelites and use it for the service of the tent of meeting. It will be a memorial for the Israelites before the Lord, making atonement for your lives. They numbered the people. Now, the first thing that I would bring to your attention regarding this is, whose idea was this to number them? It was not Moses' idea. This was God's idea. And they numbered them, and in numbering them, what does this symbolize? What was the purpose for the numbering? You know, I remember when I worked on the dairy for years, Claudel, we used to get out and put number tags in the ears of all those cows, and they were all numbered. And we never put ear tags or numbered cows that didn't belong to us. So it was always our cows that were getting numbered, not someone else's. Branding, the same thing. You brand your animals, not someone else's. In numbering these people, this was God's idea, and God is showing ownership here. The only people that God counted were the Israelites. No slaves, no foreigners, Israelites. As a matter of fact, they even narrowed down who he was to count. They were not only to be Israelites, but they had to be 20 years old. So he's numbering these people, and he's numbering them according to their clans. He's coming up with numbers, which also gives him the number of soldiers or fighting men that they can count on. But that wasn't the primary purpose for the census. The census' primary purpose was to show these people that they were owned or bought with a price, and that they belonged not to Israel, but they belonged to whom? To God. These were God's people, and they were physically demonstrated that they were God's people by numbering them. And they would move them from one group to another depending on how they'd been numbered. And the clans stayed together. So the census was a good census. It was ordered by God, and it was one of the primary purposes of the census was, one, to show ownership of who they owed their allegiance to, and two, he went into a situation where he started requiring money from them, a half shekel. And this half shekel was a tax, if you will, to be put on everybody male who was 20 years or older. And it was an equal amount, or in today's terminology, would call that a flat tax. No matter what your bank account looked like, you paid 1/2 shekel. Whether you had a lot of money or a little money, you paid 1/2 shekel. So it was a flat tax. Where'd the money go? Went for the maintenance of the tabernacle. I read something while I was studying for this. They estimate that the tabernacle, which had pillars that the poles fit into, okay? Those pillars were made out of silver. They estimated there were 4 tons of silver pillars they had to carry around with them. 4 tons. Just the pillars. So this was quite a feat to move this tabernacle from one place to the other. And this tabernacle could only be moved by Levites. They were the only ones allowed to move this thing. They were the only ones allowed to touch this thing. And to get more specific, certain parts of that temple could only be touched by a certain clan in that was the Kohaths. And the Kohaths were the descendants of Moses' family. Aaron, Miriam, and the bunch. So it was very specific as to what and who could move this thing, and it was tedious to move, to say the least. There were approximately 23,000 Levites. So they had plenty of help. But the maintenance, the costs of maintaining this tabernacle, you could see would be extensive. So they being Moses, charged a flat tax of all the people 20 years old male. There were approximately 650,000 men at that time. And they all paid a half shekel. In today's money, that would be around 30 cents. So it wasn't a big deal. But everybody was required to pay that for the maintenance of the temple. It later became, in Matthew chapter 17, that half shekel became an annual tax that everybody paid. As a matter of fact, Jesus was talking about that in Matthew 17, and when he was quizzed as to how he was going to come up with his money and the money for the apostles, what did Jesus tell them to do? Go fishing. Get the money out of a fish's mouth. And that's what they did. Now notice something. In this census that they're being told to take, and a tax that's being placed on them, notice that this tax is not a free will offering. This is a requirement, a once a year requirement that they pay this tax. And it's a flat tax. It's not a proportional tithe, it's a flat tax. If this money is not an atonement, it marked those who were already atoned for. It marked those who were already atoned for. It wasn't a free will offering. Instead of a pattern of our own giving, this money was a picture of the cost of our redemption. These were redeemed people out of Egypt. The rich were not to give more, and the poor were not to give less. To signify all souls were equally precious. Connie's salvation was not more costly than Skeeter's. Everybody's salvation cost the same, regardless of who you were. And all were equally precious in the sight of God. There's all equality. There was no difference of outward circumstances, and circumstances could affect the state of the soul, but that couldn't happen here. All had sinned, and all must be redeemed by the same price. Do you see that? Somebody say yes. So it was an equal tax. Not a tithe, it was an equal tax. It was a unconditional tax. Now in 1 Corinthians chapter 16, verse 2. 1 Corinthians 16, verse 2. About the collection for God's people. Do what I told the Galatian churches to do. On the each one of you should set aside a sum of money in keeping with his income. That isn't what we've been reading. This says in keeping with his income, saving it up so that when I come, no collections will have to be made. Then when I arrive, I will give letters of introduction to the men you approve and send them with your gift to Jerusalem. If it seems advisable to me to go also, I will accompany them. Now here is a mandate being talked about to take a collection how often? First day of every week. What kind of collection is this? This collection is based on what? In keeping with your income. This is a proportional collection. Based on what? Your income. So this would mean that people with a higher income are going to give more than people with a lesser income. And we know what tithe means in here. We're talking about 10%. So between the Old Testament and the New Testament, requirements for giving changed. They were changed from an old covenant to a new covenant. Now the question comes up, if we're not living under the old covenant anymore, why do we even bother to read about it? If we're living under a new covenant with a new set of rules, why would we even bother to study about the old covenant in Exodus to begin with? If we're not living under that and we're not practicing that set of rules, what significance has it to us today at all? Well, the groundwork's being laid in the Old Testament for giving. But not only is the groundwork being laid for giving, the groundwork is also being laid for what it cost God to get you out of Egypt. And even though the giving of his son, the crucifixion of his son, hasn't happened yet, you can see the foresight that's starting to prevail as these lessons are starting to be put into effect. The groundwork is being laid for the way these people are to think about their lives. And they have to realize that it cost God something to get them out of Egypt. And now they need to realize who they are. What do we see in here? We're seeing them slowly changing their mindset. Slowly beginning to think differently. And God's taking them one step at a time. And what God does is He starts off this process. Remember, they're still at the base of Mount Sinai, and they have just seen some magnificent things happening regarding the mountain and the presence of God on that mountain. And in the next chapter, we're going to see that during the time Moses was gone, they decided they needed a new God. We're in that in-between time right now. And God is numbering these people. But He's numbering not only to show how many they were. I suspect you could make the argument God already knew how many they were. But He's showing them who they are. And by having them being numbered, it's showing ownership. God is numbering people that belong to Him. And He's told them that from the beginning. He's told them, I will be your God, and you will be my people. Well, now there's a physical demonstration taking place, and God is going to show them by numbering them and moving them from one side of the line or space to another, that not only are they His people, but they're going to pay a minimum price for maintenance of a tabernacle that is the sanctuary of God Himself. Does this make sense? Now, let's go to Numbers, chapter 1. The Lord spoke to Moses in the tent of meeting in the desert of Sinai on the first day of the second month of the second year, and the Israelites came out of Egypt. And He said, take a census of the whole Israelite community by their clans and families, listing every man by name, one by one. You and Aaron are to number by their divisions all the men of Israel, 20 years old or more, who are able to serve in the army. One man from each tribe, each the head of his family, is to help you. And these are the names of the men who are going to assist you. We're going to skip all of that for lack of time, and we're going to drop down to verse 46. 46. All the Israelites 20 years old or more who were able to serve in Israel's army were counted according to their families, and the total number was 603,550. The families of the tribe of Levi, however, were not counted along with the others. Why? Because they were given a specific job. Read the next verse. The Lord said to Moses, "You must not count the tribe of Levi or include them in the census of the other Israelites. Instead, appoint the Levites to be in charge of the tabernacle of the testimony." And it goes on to say what their duties would be. So the Levites were not counted in this census. The Levites were claimed as priests by God himself. And notice in verse 49, "You must not count the tribe of Levi or include them in the census of the Israelites. Instead, appoint the Levites to be in charge of the tabernacle of the testimony over all its furnishings and everything belonging to it. They are to carry the tabernacle and all its furnishings. They are to take care of it and encamp around it. Whenever the tabernacle is to move, the Levites are to take it down. Whenever the tabernacle is to be set up, the Levites shall do it. Anyone else who goes near it shall be put to death." So not only were they the ones to take it down, they were the ones to set it up, and they were the ones who camped around it, which literally created a buffer between the tribes and the tabernacle itself. Now you have a tribe of roughly 23,000 who are camped around the tabernacle, and these are the ones who serve God in the tabernacle itself. They're not only not counted in the survey, they're not required to fight. And as we see later, as they divvy up land after they cross the Jordan, they're not given any land because they are the property of God. The other tribes are to support the the Levites. Now, go to 2 Samuel, 2 Samuel 24:1. 2 Samuel. Verse 1, "Again the anger of the Lord burned against Israel, and he incited David against them, saying, 'Go take a census of Israel and Judah.' So the king said to Joab and the army commanders with him, 'Go throughout the tribes of Israel from Dan to Beersheba and enroll the fighting men, so that I may know how many there are.' But Joab replied to the king, 'May the Lord your God multiply the troops 100 times over, and may the eyes of my Lord the king see it. But why does my Lord the king want to do such a thing?'" Joab's questioning David's motives here. Verse 4, "The king's word, however, overruled Joab and the army commanders, so they left the presence of the king to enroll the fighting men of Israel. After crossing the Jordan, they camped near Aroer, south of the town in the gorge, and then went through Gad and on to Jazer, and they went to Gilead and the region of Tahim Hodashi, and on to Dan Jan, and around to Sidon. Then they went toward the fortress of Tyre and all the towns of the Hivites and Canaanites, and finally on to Beersheba in the Negev of Judah. After they had gone through the entire land, they came back to Jerusalem at the end of 9 months and 20 days. So this took a while. And Joab reported the number of fighting men to the king in Israel. There were 800,000 able men who could handle a sword, and in Judah, 500,000 men. So between the first census we read about in Exodus and this census in 2 Samuel, which occurred later on, they had gone to about 1.3 million people. Fighting men only, not people, fighting men over the age of 20. That's quite an army. 1.3 million. David was conscience-stricken after he had counted the fighting men, and he says to the Lord, I have sinned greatly in what I have done. Now, O Lord, I beg you, take away the guilt of your servant. I've done a foolish thing. Why would this census be any different than the census I just read to you in Exodus? They're just counting men. And yet, the results of this census are far different than what happened in Exodus. What's the difference? Nobody wants to venture a guess? What's the difference here? We're just counting fighting men. What's the big deal here? God told him to take the census in Exodus. Who told him to take the census in 2 Samuel? David. And if the Exodus census was to show ownership that these people belonged to God, what was the purpose of David's census? To show ownership to whom? To David. David's the king. He initiates a census, and Joab picks up immediately, you sure you want to do this? And questions David. And David tells him, just do what you're told. Joab took almost 10 months to complete this census. Comes up with 1,000,003. He goes back to David, and all of a sudden, 10 months later, David's conscience has gotten a hold of him. And he realizes this wasn't God initiated. And one interesting thing that you have to know about David, if you read anything, he was sensitive to the heart of God. He didn't always do the right thing, but he seemed to know how to get forgiveness. He was conscious of the heart of God. And during that 10-month period when they came back and reported this to him, it said that he was conscience-stricken after he had counted the fighting men. And he said to the Lord, I've sinned greatly in what I've done. What was the sin? He demonstrated to these people that they should have allegiance to David instead of God. And this caused David a problem. Verse 11. Before David got up the next morning, the word of the Lord had come to Gad, the prophet, David's seer. And God said, go tell David, this is what the Lord says. I'm giving you 3 options. Choose one of them for me to carry out against you. Now, this is an unusual story in that God is going to let David pick his poison. Verse 13, so Gad went to David and said to him, shall there come upon you 3 years of famine in your land? Or 3 months of fleeing from your enemies while they pursue you? Or 3 days of plague in your land? Now then think it over and decide, how I should answer the one who sent me. Which punishment would you like? 3 years of famine? 3 months of war where they're pursuing you, which means you're losing? Or 3 days of plague? Verse 14, David said to Gad, I'm in deep distress. Let us fall into the hands of the Lord, for his mercy is great. But do not let me fall into the hands of men. I'll trust God's punishment more than men's. So the Lord sent a plague on Israel from that morning until the end of the time designated, and 70,000 of the people of Dan to Beersheba died. 70,000. And when the angel stretched out his hand to destroy Jerusalem, the Lord was grieved because of the calamity and sent the angel who was afflicting the people enough. Withdraw your hand. And the angel of the Lord was then at the threshing floor of Anariah the Jebusite. And when David saw the angel who was striking down the people, he said to the Lord, I am the one who has sinned and done wrong, but these people are sheep. What have they done? Let your hand fall upon me and my family. And David stopped the killing at that threshing floor. Now, what's the difference in these two senses? Well, part of it you've already discussed. One was initiated by God and one wasn't. One had a different intent than the other. And allegiance in the Exodus census was to God. Allegiance to the 2 Samuel census was to David. And they had completely different results. And it ended up costing Israel 70,000 people before it got stopped. Interesting enough, in these census, one of the punishments, which is the one David selected, was what? A plague. A plague. Similar to what we have going on right now. I would venture to say that the United States is in the midst of a plague. How would we stop that plague? Well, one of the things that's being touted right now as the savior of this plague is going to be these vaccines that are coming out. I don't know if they all work or not. According to the news, they do. We don't know if there's any side or effects or not. It's just too early to tell. But it's being touted that this is going to stop this plague. How did David stop a plague? By appealing to God. He humbled himself. It says in verse 10 that he was conscience-stricken. What would happen? Well, let me ask you this before I ask this question. Is being humbling and turning to God an answer to stopping the coronavirus?
It could be. Very well could.
What would it require?
If all the people humbled themselves and asked God, then I think he would answer.
Isn't there a verse that says that? Almost to that very word? If my people humble themselves and pray, I will hear and answer their prayer. What happened to that being a vaccine? So I would submit to you that this plague that was started by David's orders and turned out to be the wrong way was stopped by David's humbleness, his conscience-stricken grief, and it stopped the plague. And interesting enough, David could see that angel. Now, I don't know how that happened, but he saw that angel and met that angel at this guy's threshing floor and stopped that angel from entering Jerusalem, because that angel was coming for Jerusalem. There could have been many more people than 70,000 killed. Jerusalem had over 200,000 in it at that time. I was reading something. Mike, I watched all the episodes on that pursuit of Paul. Did you? It's fascinating. There's like 8 of them. Very well done. And it takes you to all these different places that Paul preached in. Those places still exist today. They're in ruins now, but some of the ruins are well enough preserved to where you can actually see or get a feel for some of the stuff he walked into. Some of these towns, Ephesus, some of the others, were very modern towns for their eras. I mean, they had running water, they had sewer systems, they had tremendous buildings. This was not a bunch of huts and tents out in the desert. These were port cities that were full of commerce. The point being, some of these towns were pretty big. 200,000-300,000 people lived in some of these towns. Jerusalem was just one of these. And these were the towns that Paul was visiting. If you get a chance to see that, some of that's really interesting. The point being that David stopped this angel before he got into Jerusalem. Or these numbers could have been a lot higher than 70,000. The other thing I need you to take away from this was one of the punishments that were given, that David was given the choice of choosing, was a plague. The plague. And he said that he would rather have God administer punishment to him than men. The plague. My purpose of bringing all this up today was because I was a little curious about this census type stuff, and I never really truly understand why they were counting these guys and what the significance of that was until I figured out they were counting people that belonged to someone. You don't count people that don't belong to you. When I ask you, Lucy, how many people are in your family, you don't count the neighbors and the neighbors and the neighbors. You count your people. This is exactly what God was doing here. And he was demonstrating to them who his people were. Now, let's talk about another part of God's people. And this is something we don't like to talk about anymore. Let's talk about the Sabbath. What is the purpose of the Sabbath? Let's go back to Exodus chapter 31. Exodus 31. Look at verse 12. The Lord said to Moses, say to the Israelites, you must observe my Sabbaths. This will be a sign between me and you for the generations to come, so you may know that I am the Lord who makes you holy. Verse 14, observe the Sabbath, because it is holy to you. Anyone who desecrates it must be put to death. However, whoever does any work on that day must be cut off from his people. For 6 days work is to be done, but the seventh day is a Sabbath of rest, holy to the Lord. Whoever does any work on that Sabbath day must be put to death. The Israelites are to observe the Sabbath, celebrating it for generations to come as a lasting covenant. It will be a sign between me and the Israelites forever. For in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth, and on the seventh day he abstained from work and rested. Now that's pretty black and white. What was the reason for the Sabbath? Day of rest. God demonstrated the Sabbath by working 6 days and resting one. God also showed and said, how long is the Sabbath to be in effect? Verse 16, the Israelites are to observe the Sabbath, celebrating it for generations to come as a lasting covenant. How long is the Sabbath to be observed? Forever. Does that mean today? Yes. So if you work today, Lucy, do you get stoned?
No.
Why?
Because God's mercy. A lot of people have to work today.
All right, let me ask you something. How is it that God's mercy will keep you from being stoned, but God's mercy was not on your mind when you worked on Sunday? Which part of God's rules do we obey, and which part of God's rules do we ignore?
Well, we try to obey them all. Some people have to work on Sunday.
It says here, if you work on Sunday, you get stoned.
This was in the Old Testament.
Okay?
I don't think it applies to us today.
Now this was black and white. If you worked, you died. Now this is old covenant. This is old literature. This is old school. But yet I said earlier, I set you guys up for this. Why do we study the Old Testament? If it doesn't apply today, why do we even study? Why do we even have it anymore?
I think it's the groundwork for the New Testament.
All right, if it's the groundwork for the New Testament, I have groundwork here that says you don't work on Sunday. And yet we know that there's certain circumstances where we have to work on Sunday. How do we fit this in? Because I want to talk about this for a little bit. I got about 10 minutes left. I want to talk about this for a few minutes because I found this very interesting. Let me tell you what my thoughts are, and then I want to hear something from you. If the Old Testament lays the groundwork for the New Testament, if the Old Testament is what gives you the mindset of God and shows you how adamant that God was, because the Lord said to Moses, say to the Israelites, you must observe my Sabbath. That is a definitive positive statement. I don't hear anything there that says, unless you have to work. You must observe the Sabbath. This will be, and here's the key. Listen to the next sentence. This will be a sign. Why do you observe the Sabbath? Now, the answer that's obvious is because it's for rest. But that's not what this says. It says that it's a sign. What is it a sign of? This will be a sign between you and me for generations to come, so that you may know that I'm the Lord that makes you holy. What's the reason for the Sabbath? It's not for rest. What's it for? A sign to us that you may know what? That He's our God. How many of us have forgot that on Sunday? And now you have a reason to understand if the Sabbath is only a day off, if it's only a day of rest, you missed the reason for the Sabbath. The reason for the Sabbath was to rest so that you could clear your mind to remind yourself of what? That God is your God. And that it was a covenant between you and Him, and God is trying to drill that into your mind, and it's to last from generation to generation. Not just for these people, it's for us today. And it's not for, it's for every Sunday, and we call the Sabbath Sunday. You can call the Sabbath anything you want. For the Jews, it's Saturday. I don't think it's important which day it is, but it's important that is a day set aside that you remember who you are. You see, I keep hearing this Old Testament put things in us, Lucy, that's changing how we think. God's counting people to show you who you belong to. I see a correlation here. That's why I put these together. Not only is a census reminding you of who you are, a Sabbath is reminding you of who you belong to. It says here, the Lord said to Moses, say to the Israelites, you must observe the Sabbath. This will be a sign between me and you for generations to come, so you may know that I am the Lord who makes you holy. Have we forgot that? Have we forgot that it is God that makes us holy? Now, you're going to tell me that can't be enforced always today because our modern society has changed. What's our modern society got to do with God's command that we keep a Sabbath holy? Have we taken our society and made it fit into our Bible? Or should we take our Bible and make it fit into our society? And now maybe I'm going to bring up something that you may or may not put in this. Perhaps we have a reason because of our thinking in this society of ours to understand why we have a plague in our nation today. We forgot who God is. Well, I came up with some stuff. Let me read some stuff to you. These are Sabbath commands. And I'm not going to ask you to look them all up, because I've got them all in one place here. It's in my old Bible, which is very hard to read, because apparently it got wet, and all of my text has shrunk. So it's harder to read than it used to be. But I'm going to attempt to. Yeah. This has to do with keeping the commands of Sabbath. It says, remember the Sabbath day and keeping it holy. 6 days in Exodus, this says, in 34 it says, 6 days you shall labor, but on the seventh day you shall rest. Even during the plowing season and the harvest season, you must rest. Exodus, do not light a fire in your dwelling on the Sabbath day. Numbers, when the neighboring peoples bring merchandise or sell, or let me restart again. When the neighboring peoples bring merchandise or grain to sell on the Sabbath, we will not buy from them on the Sabbath or any holy day. Every seventh year we will forgo working the land and will cancel all debts. Isaiah, blessed is the man who does this, the man who holds it fast, who keeps the Sabbath without desecrating it, and keeps his hand from doing evil. Isaiah, if you keep your feet from breaking the Sabbath and from doing as you please on my holy day, if you call the Sabbath a delight and the Lord's holy day honorable, and if you honor it by not going your own way and nor doing as you please, or speaking idle words, then you will find joy in the Lord. And I will cause you to ride on the heights of the land, and to feast on the inheritance of your father Jacob. The mouth of the Lord has spoken. Does that sound like what we're doing today? I wonder. Now, Jesus got in trouble for healing on the Sabbath. So I came up with some stuff regarding that. Nevertheless, how much more valuable is a man than a sheep? Therefore, it is lawful to do good on the Sabbath. When the Sabbath came, he began to teach in the synagogues, and many who heard him were amazed. Where did this man get these things, they asked. What's this wisdom that has been given him, that he even does miracles? Now in John, now on that day on which Jesus had made the mud and opened the man's eyes was the Sabbath. Acts, on the Sabbath we went outside the city gate to the river, where we expected to find a place of prayer. We sat down and began to speak to the women who had gathered there. Again in Acts, as was his custom, Paul went into the synagogue, and on 3 Sabbath days he reasoned with them from the Scriptures. It is lawful to do good deeds on the Sabbath. And one more, the desecration under the Mosaic law. And we're going to talk about this for a few minutes after I finish reading this. I want to fill your mind with what the rules are in the Bible, in the Old Testament and some in the New, regarding the Sabbath. It says, nevertheless, some of the people went out on the seventh day to gather manna, but they found none. Remember when God told them, you gather for 6 days and you don't gather on the seventh? Some of them didn't listen. And they went out and found there was nothing there. Exodus, then the Lord said to Moses, how long will you refuse to keep commands and my instructions? Observe the Sabbath because it is holy to you. Anyone who desecrates it must be put to death. Whoever does any work on that Sabbath day must be cut off from his people. Doing ordinary work? In those days I saw men in Judah treading wine presses on the Sabbath, and bringing in grain and loading it on donkeys together with wine grapes, figs, and other kinds of loads. And they were all bringing all they had into Jerusalem on the Sabbath. Therefore I warned them against selling food on that day. They couldn't open their grocery stores on that day. But if you do not obey and keep the Sabbath day holy by carrying any load as you come through the gates of Jerusalem on the Sabbath day, then I will kindle an unquenchable fire in the gates of Jerusalem that will consume her fortress. Yet the people of Israel rebelled against me in the desert, and they did not follow my decrees, but rejected my laws by them, and they utterly desecrated my Sabbath. So I would pour out my wrath on them and destroy them in the desert. I will disperse you among the nations and will scatter you through the countries, and I will put an end to your uncleanness. Now, all those have to do with the Sabbath. If the Sabbath isn't as important today as it used to be, why is all that in there? You see, what I've read you as I'm trying to get you to see that the Sabbath is still important, even though it is in the Old Testament. Perhaps, and I'm giving you food for thought here, perhaps some of the problems we're having with America today is we've ignored God. We've ignored God. You see, one of the things we say today is the Sabbath was a day of rest. It is a day of rest, but that wasn't its intent. It was to remind you of who God is and who you are. You are a holy people because of a holy God. Look at this church this morning. You'd think the whole city of Tolleson would be in a church somewhere this morning. I doubt that that's the case. You would think the whole city of Phoenix would be in a church this morning, especially with all the pandemic going on this morning. I venture to say they're not. And I suspect, and this is just my opinion, that the only thing holding back further wrath from God is the people that are there. Otherwise, there'd be nothing to stop God from just cleaning this out and starting over. Perhaps you're the anchor that's keeping Tolleson alive this morning. Maybe you're the ones.
And I can remember when all the stores, all over, was closed on Sunday.
Yeah,
And Circle K came in.
I remember. You know, Lucy, I remember going to this church right behind Pete's. That used to have a steeple on it, and they would have a bell up there they'd ring every Sunday morning. And I could hear it down here where we lived on Washington. And that was our signal to get ready and go to church. And you went down to that church, and that church was always full, and I remember going in there, and if you didn't get there on time or a little early, you stood in the back. Because the place was full.
I can remember the church right across the street being that way.
Yes. Why is that not happening today? What's changed? Perhaps we don't honor the Sabbath anymore, and I'm using that as a demonstration. It's because we have forgot who God is. And in forgetting who God is, have we also forgot who we are? You see, God took the time to have those people numbered to prove to them not only that He was counting His people, but for them to realize they were His people. Then later He goes in and gives them a set of rules regarding Sabbaths. And it was the same purpose. He wanted them to realize they were His people. And they were holy because He was holy. But somewhere in this 2,000-year process, I think we have forgot two things: who we are and who God is. And we sit around and complain about all the things that are happening to us, how our country's going in the wrong direction. You know why our country is headed in the wrong direction? Because we're headed in the wrong direction. We tolerate and allow things to happen today that we would never have put up with 20 years ago. Even in our own lifetime, Sister Clark, we're seeing things we would have never imagined before. And that's the problem I keep hearing. We seem to think it's going to get worse.
I can remember way back that when there were situations like this, my grandma would get us all together and we would get on our knees and we would pray and pray for days and days for things to get better and just get on our knees and pray. And now it's like, whatever, it's going to get worse. And people just take it as it comes. And the prayer is just not there.
It just is what it is. And it's going to get worse.
You know, Pastor Ken, the other day I stopped by the Q-tip right here on the 83rd, somewhere up in 83rd, and there was this young couple sitting, covering up with one blanket, just shivering because it was cool that night. And this young couple, there isn't another little, the Lord would be sending me to his, like, wherever I'm at, I've been praying for people. they want to get to know the Lord not if they're out there in the street. I mean, that crushed me.
We have a situation today where we're challenged with a sickness, a pandemic, they're calling it, a virus, whatever you want to call this. The problem that we have is we're challenged, which is causing us to react to that, and it's critical how we react to that. Lucy's presented an atmosphere or an attitude which is prevalent today. It's going to get worse. And I'll submit to you, does it have to get worse?
Till all the people get on their knees and ask God to heal our land. It's gonna get worse.
So what we're saying right now is however many people what we have that do believe in Christ and that we can turn to God, it apparently isn't enough.
That's why the Bible says if the world, not the world, but people in the world could humble themselves like the children, our world wouldn't be the way it is.
So we have a situation here that we need to deal with. Either more of our people need to humble themselves and we need to find God again, or Christ is going to come and take the ones that are ready out and let the place go to hell. Yes. Yes. So I wanted to bring this to you because I know that these, especially the Sabbath, is a controversial thing. I understand that. And I do understand that there's an Old Testament and a New Testament. But I still do believe that the Old Testament gives us a mindset, gives us some of the heart of God. And I want you to understand something. I think God takes this a lot more seriously than some of us do. And you all remember and can substantiate the difference between things used to be and even in your own lifetimes and what things have evolved into now. And it clearly looks to me like we are not headed in the correct direction. And now we're starting to see the results of that. Any questions or comments?
Do you believe that the reason God had an issue with David counting the people is he did not become himself sufficient? And in the big numbers, they just kept that mindset.
Sure.
He wanted them reliant on him as their protector.
God, or David rather, he had 1,000,003 soldiers. Do you realize the America today doesn't have 1,000,003 soldiers? David had a bigger army than we have today. Would it be easy for David to get into a situation being that he had more riches than probably anyone in the world? He had houses, he had everything he needed to survive, that he could have become self-reliant. But isn't it interesting that the Bible records that David became conscience-stricken? It took him 10 months, but he ended up becoming conscience-stricken. Now, Joab tried to warn him, this isn't the thing you want to do. He didn't listen. But 10 months later, he was conscience-stricken. And what did he do? He turned to God and said, I sinned. But it took him 10 months. Sure, he could have gotten there.
Well, however long doesn't it take other people to turn to God? Years and years and years before they realize this is it. Can't do it anymore.
Yeah.
Only when they're in the need of it is when they turn to God. God bails them out, takes them out, blesses them, gives them whatever, and they go right back.
Well, God's relented and stopped his punishment before the death angel got to Jerusalem, or there'd have been more than 70,000 dead. I mean, Jerusalem was a big town. That could have been 270,000 people died. Who knows? The point is, have we forgot who God is? Have we become